Why would a righteous man be hunted by disaster? Who speaks first in Job, heaven or earth? And when God finally answers, does he explain anything at all? The book of Job begins like a shadow play between two realms. On earth, Job is described as blameless, prosperous, and deeply reverent. In heaven, a challenger appears, often rendered as the accuser, and questions whether Job's faith is genuine or simply protected by comfort. The text presents a test that is unsettling, not because it is simple, but because it is not. What follows is loss upon loss, then silence so heavy it almost sounds like judgment. But here's the thing. Job is not only a story about pain, it is also a courtroom, a funeral, a debate hall, and finally a storm. Many readers remember the suffering, but miss the argument beneath it. The book refuses easy formulas. It pushes back against the idea that every wound is punishment and every blessing is proof of innocence. Some historical framing around dating and composition remains debated, but the moral pressure of the text is unmistakable. Our thesis is this: Job reveals that innocent suffering can exist under God's sovereignty without reducing God to cruelty or reducing faith to a transaction. And our path is clear. We begin with Satan's challenge in heaven, move through Job's suffering and silence, confront the friend's false theology, and end at God's whirlwind answer, where the deepest question is not erased, but reframed. First, the challenge in heaven. The accuser does not deny Job's obedience. He questions its motive. Remove the hedge, remove the gifts, and devotion will collapse. That accusation still echoes today. Is faith loyalty or leverage? Is worship love or insurance? The narrative allows the test, but does not celebrate the pain. It shows permission, boundary, and mystery in the same breath. Then comes the collapse of Job's world. Family shattered, wealth gone, body broken. And after the first cries, a long and haunting stretch of words where Job speaks, then waits, then speaks again, as if trying to keep talking to God while standing in the dark. He does not speak like a detached philosopher. He speaks like a man bleeding meaning. That is why the book feels modern. It does not censor grief. It lets lament become prayer. Next, enter the friends, and this is where many viewers will recognize a familiar wound. They start with presence, which is wise, and move into explanation, which becomes cruel. Their system is neat. The innocent prosper, the guilty suffer, therefore Job must be hiding sin. It sounds theological, it sounds confident, and it is wrong. Their error is not that they mention justice, but that they weaponize it. Here's what most people miss. Bad theology can speak in pious tones while failing to see the person in front of it. Finally, the whirlwind. God answers, but not with a tidy chain of causes. Instead, Job is led through creation's vastness, wild creatures, deep waters, foundations of earth, limits of human sight. The speech is not mockery, it is reorientation. Job is not given trivia about his tragedy. He is given a vision of scale, wisdom, and creaturely limits. Some imagery and translation nuances are debated among scholars, yet the central movement stands. Job moves from demanding a case file to encountering the living God. If you have ever asked why heaven feels silent while your life burns, Job does not hand you a slogan. It gives you a path through fire without lying about the heat. Hold this close. Faith is not proven by never trembling. Faith is proven by refusing to let go of God in the trembling. So stay with me to the end. We will walk the accusation, the ashes, the arguments, and the storm, and we will ask the hardest question honestly. When suffering has no clear reason, what kind of trust is still possible? What kind of faith survives when every visible sign of favor is stripped away? If goodness cannot guarantee safety, what exactly are we trusting? That is the unsettling ground beneath the book of Job, and it is why this ancient text still feels painfully current. The story does not begin in a village, a field, or a courtroom on earth. It opens with a scene above human sight where Job's integrity is named and then immediately questioned. Not denied, questioned. The accuser does not say Job is wicked. He suggests Job is devoted only because devotion is profitable. Listen closely to that charge because it echoes through every generation. If blessings disappear, will worship remain? If protection is removed, is love for God still possible? The narrative frames this as a real test, but not a test without limits. Permission is granted, and boundaries are set. Job can be touched but not erased at once. The text gives neither a cold mechanic nor a full explanation. It gives tension. God is sovereign, and yet the suffering that follows is not praised, romanticized, or called good in itself. That distinction matters. In the opening chapter, Job is introduced as upright, reverent, and careful, even interceding for his children after feasting in case hidden sin has occurred. Then in rapid succession, catastrophe arrives through human violence, natural disaster, and personal collapse. Is this random chaos or a moral trial? The book refuses to let us choose easy categories. The disasters are narrated as events in history, yet framed by a cosmic accusation. Heaven and earth overlap, but not in ways Job can see. And that is part of the wound. We, as readers, receive a glimpse of the heavenly council scene. Job does not. He suffers without the explanatory preface we were given. He feels the ash, the torn skin, the silence. We hear the opening argument. He only hears the wind and the grief. So when we ask whether Job teaches a transactional faith or an enduring trust, we must remember this asymmetry. Trust for Job is not trust after answers. It is trust without access. Some readers stumble over the figure often translated as Satan, because the Hebrew term can also function as the accuser or adversary in a legal sense. Is this a personal evil being in full later biblical form, or an office-like role in the narrative's courtroom imagery? Scholars debate that framing. But whatever precise theological mapping one prefers, the narrative function is clear. The charge is aimed at motive. It says that piety is rent, not love. It says reverence is a contract, not loyalty. And if that accusation is true, then faith is merely economics: serve and receive, obey and prosper, praise while protected, curse when exposed. The book of Job places that logic on trial before anything else happens. The disasters are terrifying, yes, but beneath them is a question sharper than loss. Is there such a thing as non-transactional faith? Can a human being love God when no immediate reward remains? Here is where the first contrast appears. The accuser sees devotion as strategy. Job's earliest response, even in grief, is framed as surrendering ownership. What was given can be taken. Yet that does not mean Job becomes emotionally numb. He tears his robe. He falls. He speaks. This is not stoicism. It is wounded reverence. The text does not ask him to feel nothing. It asks whether sorrow must become betrayal. But here's the thing. The opening challenge in heaven is not the end point of Job's theology. It is the doorway into a much longer wrestling match. If we stop here, we miss the human cost and the spiritual depth. Because after the first acts of loss, the book slows down, and we enter one of Scripture's longest explorations of grief, language, and silence. And in that silence, a harder question emerges. What does faith sound like when prayer feels unanswered? When Job's suffering deepens, we move from dramatic events to interior collapse. His body fails, his social standing evaporates, his household is gone, his skin becomes a map of pain. Even his wife's brief line, often quoted for shock, reflects the extremity of their shared ruin. This is not one bad week, it is comprehensive unmaking. So what does Job do? He speaks, and he waits, and he speaks again. At first, his friends do one thing right. They sit with him in silence for 7 days, seeing that his grief is very great. For a moment, presence outruns explanation. For a moment, companionship honors mystery. Then words begin, and the atmosphere changes. Job curses the day of his birth, not God's existence. He laments life itself, not because he has no theology, but because his theology and his experience now collide. If God is just, why does the blameless man rot in public view? Could Job have hidden sin? The friends insist yes. Must suffering prove guilt? The speeches insist yes. But Job keeps resisting the equation. He admits human frailty, yet rejects the claim that his agony is a transparent sentence for secret crimes. This resistance is not rebellion for its own sake. It is moral honesty. He will not lie about his conscience just to fit a system. Notice the emotional texture here. Job does not present as a polished saint delivering calm aphorisms. He sounds fractured, contradictory, at times near despair. One moment he longs for death. Another moment he reaches toward hope that his witness is in heaven. One line burns with protest. Another trembles toward trust. Is this inconsistency, or is it what real prayer sounds like under pressure? The book seems to suggest the second. Lament is not the opposite of faith. Lament can be faith refusing to die. That matters for anyone who has whispered in the dark. If you are there, answer me. Job gives permission to speak from the ash heap without pretending the ash is pleasant. It refuses performative spirituality. It refuses the smile that denies the wound. Here's what most people miss. The silence in Job is not empty space between speeches. Silence is one of the book's main characters. There is the silence before friends speak, the silence after accusations land, the silence when heaven does not immediately answer. In modern terms, this is the crisis of perceived divine absence. Not intellectual atheism, but relational bewilderment. God is not denied. God is distant. That distance can feel like abandonment even when the text never says God has abandoned him. And this is where the episode's central dilemma tightens. If Job remains blameless in the narrative frame and still suffers beyond measure, then blessing cannot be used as a clean scoreboard of righteousness. If that scoreboard fails, then much of our instinctive religious math fails with it. Good equals reward. Bad equals punishment. Simple. Manageable. False, at least in this case. The pastoral implication is gentle but severe. You may stand in faith and still enter valleys you did not choose. You may pray sincerely and still wait longer than you thought possible. That does not prove God is cruel, and it does not prove your trust is fake. It may mean you are living inside the same unresolved tension Job endured. Still, unresolved does not mean directionless. The speeches move, and a line is being drawn between two postures. One posture weaponizes certainty. The other posture risks honest speech before God. One posture explains pain quickly. The other bears pain truthfully. Which one sounds more spiritual at first glance? Which one heals? The next movement of the book answers by exposing a very religious mistake spoken by very religious people. As Job's friends take turns, their argument becomes more polished and more dangerous. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar build a theological courtroom in which the verdict is decided before evidence is heard. Their assumptions are coherent. God is just. The world has moral order, therefore severe suffering reveals severe sin. The logic feels tight, the compassion feels thin. At first they imply, then they accuse, then they moralize. Job must repent of hidden transgression, they say in different forms, and restoration will follow. For them, repentance is not relational return. It is procedural compliance to restart the blessing machine. This is why their speeches can sound orthodox while doing violence. True statements about God are wielded in a false way against a suffering person. How do we recognize false theology when it arrives dressed in sacred vocabulary? Watch what it does to the wounded. Does it make room for complexity, or does it force confession to protect a theory? Does it sit in grief, or does it rush to tidy conclusions? The friends cannot tolerate ambiguity, so they sacrifice Job's integrity to preserve their model of justice. There is a hard irony here. They defend divine justice by misrepresenting human reality. They claim to honor God while refusing to hear their friend. They speak as if they are God's legal team, but the narrative eventually overturns their confidence. Their certainty is not courage. It is fear of a world where righteous people can suffer without immediate explanation. This is not merely ancient drama. It is a recurring pattern in religious communities. Someone suffers, and within hours explanations circulate. There must be hidden sin. There must be generational curse. There must be weak faith. Sometimes there may be moral causes in some situations, yes. Job never says suffering has no moral dimension anywhere, but it decisively rejects the universal formula that every tragedy is readable punishment. The friends also reveal another temptation. They confuse being correct in fragments with being faithful in whole. They know doctrines. They miss timing, tone, and tenderness. They can define justice, but cannot practice mercy toward the person in front of them. The book of Job suggests that theology detached from compassion becomes accusation, even when its vocabulary is biblical. Then comes Elihu, a younger speaker who enters later with fresh energy and sharp critique. Interpretations differ on whether Elihu is corrective, redundant, or transitional. Some see him preparing for divine speech. Others see him extending the same confident pattern with different emphasis. Either way, his presence increases the sense that human explanations have reached their limit. Words pile up. Certainty multiplies. Peace does not. And where is Job in this storm of speeches? Still insisting he will not confess what he has not done, still longing for an audience with God, still refusing to reduce faith to either shallow optimism or total renunciation. He wants encounter, not slogans. He wants answer, not anesthesia. If this makes him sound bold, even dangerous, that is because genuine lament often unsettles polite religion. Does Job ever cross lines in his speech? At times, his words verge on accusing God of injustice. At times, he retracts, reframes, or falls silent. The text allows the turbulence. It does not edit him into a spotless emotional model. It gives us a believer under pressure, saying too much, then saying truer things, then waiting again. In that movement, many listeners find themselves. The narrative's verdict on the friends comes near the end, where God says they have not spoken rightly about him as Job has. This does not mean every sentence Job uttered is perfect. It means his Godward honesty is truer than their defensive system. Their doctrine protected itself. Job sought God himself. So the thesis sharpens again. The book of Job is not anti-theology, it is anti-formula. It confronts the retribution machine when that machine crushes the innocent. It insists that righteousness is not a coupon, and suffering is not always a confession note. The heart of faith is not managing outcomes, but remaining in relationship when outcomes collapse. If that sounds costly, it is. But there is one movement left, the one many people remember most vividly. After human voices exhaust themselves, a new voice arrives from a place no human argument can control, not from a lecture hall, not from a friend's rebuke, from the whirlwind. And what God says there is as unsettling as everything that came before. When God finally answers, many expect a case file. Why this servant? Why these losses? Why that timeline? We expect chronology, causality, closure. Instead, Job receives questions. Where were you when the earth's foundations were laid? Can you command dawn, bind constellations, provide for wild creatures, govern the sea? The speech expands, circles, and deepens. It feels less like a legal verdict and more like a tour of reality at scales human grief cannot master. Is that a non-answer? Some readers think so. Others see it as the only answer large enough for the question. God does not call evil good. He does not mock Job's pain. He does not affirm the friend's formula. He reorients Job from courtroom control to creaturely trust. The shift is profound. Job wanted to subpoena God into human categories. God invites Job to inhabit a universe sustained by wisdom beyond human management. Consider the imagery: morning stars, deep waters, mountain goats, behemoth and leviathan. Whether one reads these creatures as poetic symbols, exalted animals, or mythic theological motifs remains debated. But the rhetorical effect is stable. The world is wider, stranger, and less controllable than moral accounting systems admit. Human beings are moral agents, yes, but not cosmic administrators. What then of justice? Is God simply saying, "I am bigger, so be quiet"? That would be a caricature. The speeches do emphasize divine transcendence, but they also display attention to creation's vulnerable life. The God who questions Job is not indifferent to detail. He knows feeding patterns of ravens, birthing cycles in wilderness, forces humans barely perceive. The point is not brute power alone, it is wise governance we cannot fully map. Job's response marks the turning point. He places his hand over his mouth, then later confesses that he spoke of things too wonderful for him. This is not humiliation by terror, it is surrender after encounter. He has not received all the reasons, he has received God's presence. And presence reframes what explanation could not resolve. Does this solve the emotional problem of suffering? Not instantly. Does it remove grief? No. Job still carries memory of loss. But the axis changes. He moves from litigating against an absent deity to standing before a present one. The central question therefore transforms. Not, can I decode every cause, but can I trust the character of God where causes remain hidden? That is exactly where the episode's thesis lands. The book of Job rejects the simplistic equation between pain and guilt, while refusing the opposite error that pain makes faith meaningless. It neither sanitizes suffering nor deifies despair. It calls for a trust that can tremble, protest, wait, and still remain open to God. There is also a caution for interpreters. The epilogue, where Job's fortunes are restored in some form, must not be read as a formula promising identical outcomes in every life. Restoration in narrative does not erase graves. It does not cancel trauma by arithmetic replacement. The text witnesses to divine mercy, but not to a mechanistic guarantee that every earthly loss will be mirrored by visible recompense on our timeline. So what can we say responsibly? We can say Job's story affirms that blameless suffering is possible. We can say religious certainty can become cruelty. We can say God's final speech redirects faith from transactional bargaining toward relational trust. We can say lament is a faithful language, not a forbidden one. Beyond that, humility is not weakness, it is fidelity to the text. If you have ever stood at the edge of unanswered prayer, Job does not call you fake. It does not command emotional denial. It gives you permission to grieve without surrendering the relationship. It warns you against friends who offer theories instead of tears. It warns you against becoming that friend yourself. And now the dilemma returns in its fullest shape. When losses come with no clean cause, will we reduce faith to terms and conditions, or will we discover a trust that survives without immediate explanation? Job says authentic trust is possible, but not cheap. It is forged where formulas fail. Maybe that is why the book remains both feared and loved. Feared because it dismantles spiritual shortcuts. Because it refuses to abandon sufferers to silence. In Job, heaven speaks last, but not to crush the questioner. Heaven speaks to enlarge him. So carry this forward. The challenge in heaven exposed the accusation that faith is selfish. The ash heap exposed the cost of remaining honest in pain. The friends exposed theology without compassion. The whirlwind exposed the limits of human control and the possibility of deeper trust. Put together, they form one argument. Faith is not proven, by uninterrupted blessing. Faith is proven by clinging to God when blessing disappears. And if that is true, then your hardest season may not be evidence that God has left. It may be the place where transactional religion dies and real trust begins. But that raises one final tension, one we cannot escape and one we must face with open eyes. If God's answer is presence more than explanation, what does faithful living look like tomorrow morning when the storm has not yet passed? So where does Job leave us after the accusation, the ashes, the arguments, and the storm? Not with a neat formula, and not with a faith that depends on immediate reward. If this book proves anything, it is that suffering cannot be read like a simple invoice for hidden sin. The opening challenge in heaven questions motive, not behavior, and that question drives everything that follows. Is devotion still devotion when protection is gone? First takeaway, Job dismantles transactional religion. The accuser's claim is clear enough. Remove the gifts and worship collapses. But Job's long struggle, however uneven, pushes back against that logic. He laments, protests, and trembles, yet keeps turning toward God rather than away. That is not polished piety. That is costly trust. Second takeaway, suffering and guilt are not always one-to-one. The friends defend a rigid moral math that sounds confident, and the narrative exposes how confidence can become cruelty. Their error is not believing God is just. Their error is assuming they can decode every tragedy from the outside. Job forces us to admit what many fear to admit. Sometimes the righteous bleed in public, while easy explanations fail. Third takeaway, God's whirlwind answer does not hand Job a timeline of causes. It offers reorientation. Some details of imagery and creature references remain debated in interpretation, and views differ on how to read the heavenly council scene in relation to later theology. But the movement is stable. Job shifts from demanding a full explanation to encountering a wisdom larger than his categories. The question is not erased, it is reframed from control to trust. And that reframing answers our central dilemma without pretending pain is small. The book of Job does not teach that faith is a bargain secured by blessings. It teaches that genuine faith can survive unanswered grief without calling God meaningless or reducing him to a machine. Innocent suffering can exist under divine sovereignty, and that truth is hard, but it is also strangely liberating. It frees sufferers from false shame, and it warns comforters against violent certainty. If you are in a season where heaven feels quiet, let this land gently. You are not disqualified by your questions. Lament is not betrayal when it is still directed toward God. The trembling hand that refuses to let go may be closer to faith than the confident voice that never learned to weep. Job's restoration at the end is often discussed as resolution, but it should be handled carefully. It testifies to mercy in the narrative, not a guarantee that every loss in every life will be visibly reversed on our schedule. No simple formula returns. No pain is trivialized. What remains is deeper than a formula. Humility and a trust that can live without full disclosure. So if this story has unsettled you, that may be its gift. It tears down the illusion that righteousness purchases immunity, and it invites a faith that is relational instead of transactional. Keep that in front of you when easy answers come too fast. If this helped you see Job with new eyes, subscribe for the next descent into Scripture's hardest mysteries. Because the next question waits in the dark. If God's answer is presence more than explanation, what happens when a whole community suffers and no one can tell where judgment ends and mystery begins? Based on what we uncovered together in today's episode, answer this in the comments. Do you think you can trust God without answers when suffering feels undeserved? And as always, God bless you.